Section 21 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Child That Went with the Fairies, Part 2. The widow Ryan's 3 children were playing, as I have said, upon the narrow old road in front of her door. Little Bill, or Liam, about 5 years old, with golden hair and large blue eyes, was a very pretty boy, with all the clear tints of healthy childhood, and that gaze of earnest simplicity which belongs not to town children of the same age. His little sister Peg, about a year older, and his brother Con, a little more than a year elder than she, made up this little group. Under the great old ash trees, whose last leaves were falling at their feet in the light of an October sunset, they were playing with the hilarity and eagerness of rustic children, clamouring together, and their faces were turned towards the west and storied hill of Lisnavora. Suddenly a startling voice with a screech called to them from behind, ordering them to get out of the way, and turning, they saw a sight such as they never beheld before. It was a carriage drawn by 4 horses that were pawing and snorting in impatience as it just pulled up. The children were almost under their feet, and scrambled to the side of the road next their own door. This carriage and all its appointments were old-fashioned and gorgeous, and presented to the children, who had never seen anything finer than a turf car, and once an old chaise that passed that way from Killaloe, a spectacle perfectly dazzling. Here was antique splendour. The harness and trappings were scarlet and blazing with gold. The horses were huge and snow white, with great manes that, as they tossed and shook them in the air, seemed to stream and float, sometimes longer and sometimes shorter, like so much smoke. Their tails were long, and tied up in bows of broad scarlet and gold ribbon. The coach itself was glowing with colours, gilded and emblazoned. There were footmen in gay liveries and 3 cocked hats, like the coachman's, but he had a great wig like a judge's, and their hair was frizzed out and powdered, and a long thick pigtail with a bow to it hung down the back of each. All these servants were diminutive and ludicrously out of proportion with the enormous horses of the equipage, and had sharp sallow features and small restless fiery eyes, and faces of cunning and malice that chilled the children. The little coachman was scowling and showing his white fangs under his cocked hat, and his little blazing beads of eyes were quivering with fury in their sockets as he whirled his whip round and round over their heads, till the lash of it looked like a streak of fire in the evening sun, and sounded like the cry of a legion of philippuics in the air. "Stop the princess on the highway!" cried the coachman in a piercing treble. "Stop the princess on the highway!" piped each footman in turn, scowling over his shoulder down on the children, and grinding his keen teeth. The children were so frightened they could only gape and turn white in their panic. But a very sweet voice from the open window of the carriage reassured them, and arrested the attack of the lackeys. A beautiful and very grand-looking lady was smiling from it on them, and they all felt pleased in the strange light of that smile. "The boy with the golden hair, I think," said the lady, bending her large and wonderfully clear eyes on little Liam. The upper sides of the carriage were chiefly of glass, so that the children could see another woman inside, whom they did not like so well. This was a black woman with a wonderfully long neck, hung round with many strings of large variously coloured beads, and on her head was a sort of turban of silk, striped with all the colours of the rainbow, and fixed in it was a golden star. This black woman had a face as thin almost as a death's head, with high cheekbones and great goggle eyes, the whites of which, as well as her wide range of teeth, showed in brilliant contrast with her skin, as she looked over the beautiful lady's shoulder and whispered something in her ear. "Yes, the boy with the golden hair, I think," repeated the lady. And her voice sounded sweet as a silver bell in the children's ears, and her smile beguiled them like the light of an enchanted lamp, as she leaned from the window with a look of ineffable fondness on the golden-haired boy with the large blue eyes, insomuch that little Billy, looking up, smiled in return with a wondering fondness. And when she stooped down and stretched her jewelled arms towards him, he stretched his little hands up, and how they touched the other children did not know, but saying, "Come and give me a kiss, my darling," she raised him, and he seemed to ascend in her small fingers as lightly as a feather, and she held him in her lap and covered him with kisses. Nothing daunted, the other children would have been only too happy to change places with their favoured little brother. There was only one thing that was unpleasant, and a little frightened them, and that was the black woman, who stood and stretched forward in the carriage as before. She gathered a rich silk and gold handkerchief that was in her fingers up to her lips, and seemed to thrust ever so much of it, fold after fold, into her capacious mouth, as they thought to smother her laughter, with which she seemed convulsed. For she was shaking and quivering, as it seemed, with suppressed merriment, but her eyes, which remained uncovered, looked angrier than they had ever seen eyes look before. But the lady was so beautiful they looked on her instead, and she continued to caress and kiss the little boy on her knee, and smiling at the other children, she held up a large russet apple in her fingers, and the carriage began to move slowly on, and with a nod inviting them to take the fruit, she dropped it on the road from the window. It rolled some way beside the wheels, they following, and then she dropped another, and then another, and so on. And the same thing happened to all, for just as either of the children who ran beside had caught the rolling apple, somehow it slipped into a hole or ran into a ditch, and looking up they saw the lady drop another from the window, and so the chase was taken up and continued till they got, hardly knowing how far they had gone, to the old cross-roads that leads to Auney. It seemed that there the horses' hoofs and carriage wheels rolled up a wonderful dust, which being caught in one of those eddies that whirl the dust up into a column on the calmest day, enveloped the children for a moment, and passed whirling on towards Lisnavora. The carriage, as they fancied, driving in the centre of it, but suddenly it subsided, the straws and leaves floated to the ground, the dust dissipated itself, but the white horses and the lackeys, the gilded carriage, the lady and their little golden-haired brother, were gone. At the same moment, suddenly the upper rim of the clear setting sun disappeared behind the hill of Knockdoola, and it was twilight. Each child felt the transition like a shock, and the sight of the rounded summit of Lisnavora, now closely overhanging them, struck them with a new fear. They screamed their brother's name after him, but their cries were lost in the vacant air. At the same time they thought they heard a hollow voice say close to them, "Go home." Looking round and seeing no one, they were scared, and hand in hand, the little girl crying wildly, and the boy white as ashes from fear, they trotted homeward at their best speed, to tell, as we have seen, their strange story. Molly Ryan never more saw her darling, but something of the lost little boy was seen by his former playmates. Sometimes when their mother was away earning a trifle at haymaking, and Nellie washing the potatoes for their dinner, or beetling clothes in the little stream that flows in the hollow close by, they saw the pretty face of little Billy peeping in archly at the door, and smiling silently at them. And as they ran to embrace him with cries of delight, he drew back, still smiling archly, and when they got out into the open day he was gone, and they could see no trace of him anywhere. This happened often, with slight variations in the circumstances of the visit. Sometimes he would peep for a longer time, sometimes for a shorter time. Sometimes his little hand would come in, and with bended finger beckoned them to follow, but always he was smiling with the same arch look and wary silence, and always he was gone when they reached the door. Gradually these visits grew less and less frequent, and in about 8 months they ceased altogether, and little Billy, irretrievably lost, took rank in their memories with the dead. One wintry morning, nearly a year and a half after his disappearance, their mother having set out for Limerick soon after cockcrow to sell some fowls at the market, the little girl, lying by the side of her elder sister, who was fast asleep, just at the grey of the morning heard the latch lifted softly, and saw little Billy enter and close the door gently after him. There was light enough to see that he was barefoot and ragged, and looked pale and famished. He went straight to the fire and cowered over the turf embers, and rubbed his hands slowly, and seemed to shiver as he gathered the smouldering turf together. The little girl clutched her sister in terror and whispered, "Waken, Nelly, waken. Here's Billy come back." Nelly slept soundly on, but the little boy, whose hands were extended close over the coals, turned and looked toward the bed, it seemed to her in fear, and she saw the glare of the embers reflected on his thin cheek as he turned toward her. He rose and went on tiptoe quickly to the door in silence, and let himself out as softly as he had come in. After that the little boy was never seen any more by any one of his kindred. Fairy doctors, as the dealers in the preternatural, who in such cases were called in, are termed, did all that in them lay, but in vain. Father Tom came down and tried what holier rites could do, but equally without result. So little Billy was dead to mother, brother, and sisters, but no grave received him. Others whom affection cherished lay in holy ground, in the old churchyard of Abington, with headstone to mark the spot over which the survivor might kneel and say a kind prayer for the peace of the departed soul. But there was no landmark to show where little Billy was hidden from their loving eyes, unless it was in the old hill of Lisnavora, that cast its long shadow at sunset before the cabin door, or that, white and filmy in the moonlight in later years, would occupy his brother's gaze as he returned from fair or market, and draw from him a sigh and a prayer for the little brother he had lost so long ago and was never to see again. End of section 21.